The room went quiet the moment he said it. Not the kind of quiet that happens when someone drops a glass or a phone rings too loud. This was different. This was the kind of quiet where 30 people all decide at exactly the same moment that they are very interested in their menus. Lionel Ashby had just told a 61-year-old woman that she was sitting at the wrong table. He hadn't whispered it. He hadn't leaned over politely and asked if there had been some confusion. He had looked at her natural hair, at her reading glasses, at the practical navy blazer she wore without a single piece of visible jewelry, and he had said it the way people say things when they are very certain the room is on their side. This is the private dining room. The bar area is through that door. Adelaide Morse did not look up from her menu right away. She finished reading the line she was on. Then she set the menu down very gently and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "I know where the bar is." 3 hours earlier, Adelaide had been in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building that had her name on the lease, though you would not have known it to look at her. She had driven herself to work, as she always did, in a 10-year-old Volvo she had no intention of replacing. She had taken the elevator with the facility staff and asked Gerald how his daughter's soccer tournament had gone. She had poured her own coffee and sat at the end of the table where the window draft was worst, because the younger analysts always looked cold, and she had been cold enough in her life to know it was miserable. The meeting had run long, the way meetings do when there is good news and everyone wants credit for it. By 6:30, the last of her team had filed out, flushed and relieved, and Adelaide had sat alone for a moment in the emptying room, looking out at the Atlanta skyline, doing what it always did at that hour, turning gold and refusing to apologize for how beautiful it was. Her phone had buzzed. Her daughter Renee, asking if she was still coming to dinner. Adelaide had looked at the time, done the math, and typed back, "On my way." 20 minutes. She had not changed clothes. She had not called ahead to remind the restaurant who she was. That was not something Adelaide Morse did. She had built Morse Group over 31 years through a combination of precision, patience, and a deeply held belief that if you needed people to know who you were before they treated you decently, something had already gone wrong. The restaurant was called 14 Oak. It sat at the top of a hotel she had actually consulted on during its development phase, a fact she had never mentioned to the management and did not intend to. Renee had chosen it because her fiancé Preston had read about it in a magazine and wanted to try the tasting menu. Adelaide had made the reservation herself, under her own name, for a private dining alcove in the back that the restaurant called the Birchwood Room. She had booked it 2 weeks in advance. She had confirmed it that morning. She gave her name at the front and was told, with a practiced smile, that someone would be right with her. She stood near the host stand for 4 minutes. She counted, not because she was impatient, but because she had spent her career noticing when time was used as a social tool, a way of communicating hierarchy without saying anything that could be quoted later. Then a man appeared, late 30s, broad-shouldered, wearing the particular expression of someone who had decided something before he arrived. His name tag said Lionel, Guest Experience Director. He looked at her. He looked at the host stand. He looked briefly toward the bar. "Can I help you find someone?" he asked. "I have a reservation," Adelaide said. "Morse, 7 o'clock, the Birchwood Room." Something moved behind Lionel's eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like recalculation. "The Birchwood Room is our private dining space," he said. "It's reserved this evening for a corporate event." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "I reserved it," she said, 2 weeks ago. I confirmed this morning. I spoke with someone named Diana." "I'm not sure who you spoke with," Lionel said, and there was something in the way he said it, a small, practiced doubt that was more insulting than anything he could have said directly. "But I'm afraid there may have been some confusion. I'd be happy to seat you in the main dining room, or the bar area has some lovely—" "Please get me Diana," Adelaide said. The smile didn't waver. "Diana is occupied with." "Then get me whoever is not occupied." He went. Adelaide stood by the host stand. The young woman working it had found something very important to study on her computer screen. Adelaide did not blame her. She had been that young woman once, at a job that paid $17 an hour, and she knew what it cost to speak up when someone with a name tag outranked you. a different person came out. A woman, 50s, silver-haired, moving with the quick efficiency of someone who actually ran things. Her tag said Claire General Manager. Ms. Morse, Claire said, and the slight emphasis on the name told Adelaide that Claire had, in the last 90 seconds, looked something up. I am so sorry for the confusion. Your room is absolutely ready. Please let me take you back. Adelaide followed her through the restaurant. They passed Lionel, who was now speaking with a couple near the window, his back very deliberately turned. The birchwood room was exactly as described. Warm light, a round table set for four, a small arrangement of white flowers in the center that Renee would like. Adelaide sat down. She ordered water. She waited for her daughter. She did not think about Lionel. Or rather, she thought about him the way she thought about most things. Not with anger, but with a kind of clear, interested attention. He had made an assumption. The assumption was wrong. What happened next would tell her considerably more about this establishment than his assumption had. Renee arrived first. Ahead of Preston by 10 minutes, which was the way it usually went. Renee had her father's energy, always slightly ahead of wherever she was supposed to be, always scanning the room when she walked in. She was 33 and worked in public health policy, and had Adelaide's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, which Adelaide considered a gift even when it was inconvenient. She hugged her mother and sat down and said, "How was the drive?" "Fine," Adelaide said. "The restaurant tried to redirect me to the bar when I arrived." Renee's expression shifted. "What?" "It's handled." Mom. "It's handled, baby." Renee looked at her for a moment with the specific look of a daughter who has watched her mother be handled her entire life and has never once seen it go the direction people expected. Then she picked up the menu. Preston arrived 9 minutes later. He was easy to like. Tall, earnest, the kind of man who held doors open, not as performance, but as habit. He kissed Adelaide on the cheek and apologized for the traffic and asked if she'd seen the article about the chef here. Adelaide said she hadn't. Preston pulled it up on his phone. The chef, he explained, had trained in Lyon and come back specifically to cook Southern food the way it was meant to be cooked, which meant crediting the people who had actually developed it. "I read that interview 3 times, Preston said. "He's the real thing." Adelaide smiled. She thought, not for the first time, that Renee had chosen well. They ordered. The food was, as Preston had promised, exceptional. The conversation moved the way good dinner conversation does, from small things to important things, without anyone seeming to steer it. Preston's family. A trip Renee was planning. A policy brief she'd been working on for 6 months that might actually change something. Adelaide listened more than she talked. This was one of her oldest habits. She had noticed early in her career that the people who talked least in rooms were often the ones who understood most, and she had decided that was the kind of person she wanted to be. It was during dessert that Lionel reappeared. He came to the entrance of the birchwood room and stood there with a man Adelaide did not recognize. Mid-50s, heavy watch, the relaxed posture of someone accustomed to being the most important person present. The stranger's name, she would learn later, was Roland Peck. He owned 3 car dealerships in the northern suburbs and had, apparently, also requested the Birchwood room for a different evening. "I apologize for interrupting," Lionel said, addressing the air slightly above Adelaide's head. "Mr. Peck and his guests are waiting for the space. We've arranged something for your party in the main dining room that I think you'll find." Adelaide set down her dessert fork. The table went quiet. Renee put her hand flat on the tablecloth. It was a gesture Adelaide recognized, her daughter making herself stay still. "We're in the middle of dinner," Adelaide said. Her voice was level. It was always level. People sometimes confused her levelness for uncertainty. They were always surprised to discover what it actually was. "Of course, and we deeply regret the timing," Lionel said, the apology sitting on top of something else entirely. "But Mr. Peck made his reservation through our corporate partnership program, which does take priority." "I'd like to speak with Claire," Adelaide said. Lionel hesitated. "Claire is." "Please get her." The man, Roland Peck, shifted his weight. He had the look of someone who had decided to find this entertaining. "Look," he said, stepping slightly into the room, "we don't want any trouble, but we did reserve this room, and we've got 12 people waiting, so if you could just—" He made a small gesture toward the door, casual, dismissive, the kind of gesture that assumed compliance. Adelaide looked at him. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just looked at him the way she'd looked at markets that told her she was wrong, at banks that told her she wasn't a serious borrower, at rooms full of men who had been surprised to find her there. She had been looking at people like this for 31 years. She had outlasted all of them. "Mr. Peck," she said, reading his name from where Lionel had used it, "I don't know you, and I don't have any particular feelings about you. But I have reserved this room, I am in the middle of a meal with my family, and I will not be moving." Peck's expression changed. The amusement drained out of it, replaced by something harder. "Do you know who I'm here with tonight?" "I don't," Adelaide said. "And I'll tell you honestly, it's not going to change my answer." He stared at her. She held his gaze without effort. It was one of the things she had trained herself to do in her 30s, when she'd noticed that most people expected her to look away first. She had decided not to. Peck turned to Lionel. "Handle this." Lionel straightened. Whatever diplomacy he'd been attempting dropped away. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask your party to relocate. This is not optional." The word "ma'am" landed the way it was meant to. "Then I'd like you to call the owner," Adelaide said. Lionel blinked. "The owner is not available." "Then I'll wait." A pause. "That's not." "I'll wait," she said again, pleasantly. "Finally." Preston had gone very still across the table. Renee was looking at her mother with an expression that was one part fury on her behalf and one part something quieter, recognition, maybe, of what was about to happen. Because Renee knew. She had known since she was 11 years old, when she'd overheard her mother on a phone call late at night, saying things like deferred payment and revised terms, and that is not acceptable in the same tone she used to ask what Renee wanted for breakfast. She had known the way children know important things, not from being told, but from watching. Adelaide had not told Renee what to say tonight. She had not needed to. Claire appeared in the doorway of the Birchwood room 3 minutes later. She looked at Lionel, then at Peck, then at Adelaide. Her expression was that of someone doing very fast arithmetic. "Ms. Morse," she said carefully, "is there a problem?" "Your director has asked my family to vacate this room in the middle of our meal," Adelaide said, "to accommodate Mr. Peck, whose reservation is, as I understand it, for a different evening." Claire looked at Lionel. It was a very specific look. "That's correct," Lionel said, but the confidence had shifted in his voice. "The corporate partnership." "The corporate partnership does not supersede a confirmed reservation," Claire said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I apologize, Ms. Morse. Please continue your dinner. Mr. Peck, we will get you situated in the main dining room, and your meal this evening is on us." Peck's jaw tightened. "This is not acceptable. Do you know what my account is worth to this hotel?" "I do," Claire said. "And I hope you'll allow us to make this right for you in the main room." She said it with the absolute finality of a woman who has made a decision and is not making another one. Peck looked at Adelaide one more time. Then he turned and walked out. Lionel followed. The room was quiet for a moment. Preston exhaled slowly. "Well," he said. Renee was watching her mother. Adelaide picked up her dessert fork. "The panna cotta is very good," she said. "Preston, you should try it." She might have let it end there. That would have been enough, to finish dinner, to tip generously, to drive home and sleep and let the night be what it was. Adelaide Morse had let many things end there over the years. Not everything needed a second act. But the next morning, she had a 9 o'clock call with her CFO, and afterward, sitting with her second cup of coffee, she pulled up the holding documents for Morse Group's real estate portfolio. She had done this before when she needed to think clearly. Not because she didn't have it memorized, but because seeing it printed settled something in her. 14 Oak sat in the Harrington Tower Hotel. The Harrington Tower Hotel sat on a long-term lease. The long-term lease was held by a property company called Westlake Commercial Partners. Westlake Commercial Partners was, as of 18 months ago, a wholly owned subsidiary of Morse Group's hospitality division. Adelaide was the final signature on every lease renewal. She had consulted on the hotel's development. She had watched it get built. She had met with the original management team twice. She had not expected to need to revisit the relationship before the next contract cycle, which was still 14 months away. She thought about Lionel. She thought about the particular way he had used the word ma'am, not as courtesy, but as punctuation, a small door being closed. She thought about the young woman at the host stand who had looked very carefully at her screen. She picked up the phone and called her VP of Hospitality Partnerships. His name was Dwight, and he had been with her for 11 years, and when she told him what had happened, he was quiet for exactly the length of time it took him to understand what she wasn't saying. "Do you want me to make a call?" he asked. "Not yet," Adelaide said. "Pull the service records for 14 Oak first, last 18 months, escalated complaints, staff incident reports, anything on guest experience patterns." Dwight came back to her that afternoon. The records were not good. 3 formal complaints involving black guests being redirected from reserved spaces, one involving a Hispanic family. In each case, the incident had been resolved, meaning the guest had been placated and the record had been closed. Not that anything had changed. Lionel Ashby had been guest experience director for 14 months. Adelaide read the records twice. Then she called the general manager of the Harrington Tower. Not Claire, who ran the restaurant, but the hotel's overall GM, a man named Curtis who had been in the position for 8 months and did not yet know, she suspected, how thoroughly his predecessor had failed to create a culture worth inheriting. She introduced herself by name. She said she was calling in her capacity as the ultimate landlord of the property. She said she would like to meet at his earliest convenience to discuss the restaurant's recent service patterns. Curtis was on the phone for about 4 seconds before she heard the specific change in his breathing that told her he had, in that moment, looked up her name. "Ms. Morse," he said. "Of course I can be available today." The meeting took 90 minutes. Adelaide brought Dwight and the lease documents. Curtis brought Claire, his operations director, and the kind of expression that suggested he had spent the previous 2 hours in a state of focused dread. Adelaide was not unkind. She had no interest in being unkind. She laid out what she had found in the service records, named the pattern without editorializing about it, and said she would like to understand what Curtis intended to do about it. Curtis fired Lionel Ashby before the meeting ended, not as a performance for Adelaide's benefit, or not only that, but because the records made clear that this had been building for over a year and someone should have caught it 8 months ago when Curtis arrived. He said as much, which Adelaide appreciated more than the firing. Claire, for her part, sat very still through most of the meeting and then said one thing. "I should have gone back out to you sooner last night. I was watching from across the room and I knew what was happening, and I waited too long." Adelaide looked at her. "Yes," she said, "you did." Claire nodded. She did not offer excuses. Adelaide noted that too. There were things that happened after, the way things always happen after. Roland Peck called Dwight's office twice, looking for clarity on whether his corporate account was being affected. Dwight told him it was under review, which was the accurate answer and also the one most likely to produce reflection. Whether Peck reflected, Adelaide neither knew nor particularly needed to know. Curtis sent a written report to Morse Group's hospitality division within 2 weeks, outlining new staff training protocols, a revised guest complaint escalation process, and a commitment to third-party review of service pattern data on a quarterly basis. It was thorough. Adelaide read it carefully and told Dwight to schedule a follow-up in 6 months. She did one other thing. There had been 3 other guests, the ones in the service records, the ones whose complaints had been resolved on paper and forgotten in practice. Adelaide had her team identify what they could, which was limited, and she authorized a program through Morse Group's foundation, a hospitality industry scholarship, specifically for people from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in hotel and restaurant management, the kind of careers where, if you were shaped by the experience of being dismissed, you might decide to build something different. She named it quietly. No press release, no event. The foundation's director asked if she wanted to do a launch announcement, and Adelaide said no. What she wanted was for it to actually work. Renee called her the night the scholarship was announced internally. Preston saw it in the foundation newsletter, Renee said. He cried a little. "Don't tell him I told you." Adelaide laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind she had more easily these days than in her 40s, when she had been spending so much energy building things that she sometimes forgot to enjoy what she was building. "How are you feeling about all of it?" Renee asked. Adelaide thought about this. She was sitting in her kitchen, which looked out over a backyard she had planted herself over many years. Not because she had needed to, but because there was something about putting things in the ground and watching them come up that no amount of professional success had ever replaced. "I feel like I'm tired of rooms deciding who belongs in them before anyone walks through the door," she said. "I've been tired of it for a long time. This time I was in a position to say something about it." "You're always in a position to say something about it," Renee said. "Not always," Adelaide said, "but more than I used to be. And the ones who aren't, that's the point, baby. That's always been the point." She heard Renee breathing on the other end of the line. Outside, the first fireflies of the season had started their business in the yard, blinking on and off in the tall grass near the fence, patient and reliable and completely unimpressed with everything that had happened. "Mom," Renee said. "Yeah, I want to be like you when I grow up." Adelaide shook her head, even though her daughter couldn't see it. "You're already better," she said. "That's how it's supposed to work." She sat there after they hung up, in the kitchen, in the quiet, watching the fireflies do what fireflies do. She thought about the birchwood room and the way the light had looked in there, warm, expensive, lovely. She thought about the young woman at the host stand who had stared at her screen. She thought about Claire saying, "I waited too long," with no excuse attached, which had told Adelaide more about Claire's character than an hour of explanation would have. She thought about Lionel, not with anger. Anger had never been her most useful tool. She thought about him the way she thought about structural problems. Clearly, diagnostically, with interest in what had allowed the condition to develop and what would need to change to prevent it from recurring. She thought about the fact that the building where this had all happened still had her name on the lease. Not on the door, not on a plaque, on a document in a filing system that most people in that building would never see. The way most real things worked. Adelaide Morse finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. In the morning, she had an early call, and she was not going to be late. I keep thinking about the moment Adelaide picked up her dessert fork after everything that had just happened in that room. Not dramatically, not to make a point. She just picked it up and said the panna cotta was good and told Preston he should try it. That's the part that stays with me. Because here's what I've come to understand, slowly, over more years than I'd like to admit. The way a person carries themselves when they have every right to be furious tells you everything about who they actually are. Lionel used the word "ma'am" like a small blade. Roland Pack made a gesture toward the door like Adelaide was furniture to be rearranged. And she sat there, steady, and did not give either of them the reaction they were counting on. That steadiness wasn't passivity. It wasn't weakness dressed up as patience. It was something I think we undervalue. The discipline to stay clear when everything around you is designed to make you cloudy. What Lionel and Roland got wrong, at the most basic level, was that they looked at Adelaide and decided what she was worth before they knew a single true thing about her. That's a failure of character first. It's also a failure of judgment. The kind that costs people dearly, eventually, because the world has a way of correcting assumptions that are built on nothing. Not always quickly, not always publicly, but the correction comes. Adelaide didn't wait for some outside force to set things right. She did something harder, she thought clearly. She went back to the documents. She looked at the pattern in those service records. 3 other guests, the same treatment. Complaints closed on paper and forgotten in practice. She understood that what happened to her wasn't an isolated bad night. It was a system that had been allowed to run without accountability, and she happened to be in a position to change that. So she did. not out of revenge, out of something closer to responsibility. That's the piece I find myself returning to most. Adelaide Morse could have let it go. By every external measure, she had already won. She finished her dinner. Lionel was corrected. Peck was moved to the main room. Most people would have called that enough, but she understood that winning for yourself and changing something for the next person are two different things, and she had the tools to do both. So she used them. The scholarship she built after. No press release, no launch event, just a quiet structure designed to actually work. That's what the full arc of that evening eventually became. I think about Renee telling her mother she wanted to be like her when she grew up, and Adelaide saying, "You're already better. That's how it's supposed to work." There's a whole philosophy in that exchange. The point of getting somewhere isn't to hold the position. It's to make the path a little clearer for whoever comes next. What Adelaide modeled that night. The calm, the precision, the refusal to shrink, and then the decision to build something lasting from what could have just been a humiliation. That combination doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from years of choosing, over and over, to respond to difficulty with integrity instead of bitterness, with clear thinking instead of reaction, and with the kind of persistence that doesn't need an audience to keep going. That, to me, is the whole story. Not the reveal, not Lionel getting fired, the fork going back to the panna cotta, and the foundation being set up quietly, and Adelaide driving herself home in a 10-year-old Volvo like the evening was simply another evening. That's what a life built on something real actually looks like.